everyone. Thank you all for being here today for our Literary Cocktail Hour, a series of monthly conversations with authors on Zoom from the Brattleboro Literary Festival. It's a wonderful way for us to keep the Literary Festival going all year. I'm Jenny Altschuler. I've been a member of the author committee of the festival since 2011. Please mark your calendars for our in-person festival, which will take place the weekend of October 13th to 15th. We'll be hosting 60 authors right here in Brattleboro. If you're not able to be here in October, many of the events will be recorded. So subscribe to our YouTube channel now to see those, and also to see recordings of authors from past festivals, including two Joyce Maynard events when she was visiting the festival. We'll have the link tree in the chat, which has a lot of important website, Joyce's website, our website, other things. So just check the link tree and you'll see a lot of information. I'm very thrilled to be talking to Joyce Maynard this afternoon. Joyce is a native of New Hampshire, and she began publishing her stories in magazines like 17 when she was 13 years old. She first came to national attention with the publication of her New York Times Magazine cover story, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life, in 1972 when she was a freshman at Yale. That article was turned into a book that was published in 1973. And I'm starting with that because that is when I first heard of Joyce, and I don't think there's an author that I've been reading and still am reading.
Who's still alive.
And it's still, you started so young and I started so young reading you. And so you're really an important, so important to me because I remember as a teen reading that book.
That was 50 years ago, Jenny.
I know. Well, I remember very clearly. So I've always followed you. Since then, she has been a reporter and a columnist for the New York Times. And I, like many people, read her domestic affairs column regularly, which that appeared in 50 papers nationwide, a regular contributor to NPR, and she's also written for many national magazines. She's a longtime performer with The Moth, and she is a fellow at the MacDowell Colony in Yaddo. She's the founder of Right by the Lake, a week-long workshop on the art and craft of memoir held every year since 2001 at Lake Atitlan, Guatemala. You
pronounced it right.
Thank you. And actually, is it 18 books now that you've written?
I think it's up to 21.
Okay, wow. On your website it says 18. So, but I thought there were more. She's the author of 21 books, including the New York Times bestselling novel Labor Day and To Die For, both adapted for film, Under the Influence, and the memoirs At Home in the World and The Best of Us. Her recent novel, Count the Ways, the story of a marriage and a divorce and the children who survived it, was published by William Morrow in July 2021. And her latest book, The Bird Hotel, was published on May 2nd this year. She has just finished a sequel to Count the Ways, which is called How the Light Gets In. So I am just, as you can all tell, very happy to be here with Joyce. And I guess it's hard to know where to begin, but why don't we begin with your newest book, The Bird Hotel, and how did you come to write that book?
So this one was totally different from any other writing experience. I mean, I guess everyone is different in some way, Jenny, yeah. But I was in Guatemala, where I go at least once a year, more than once a year, to host writing workshops for women, called Right by the Lake. And I went in March 2020. I don't need to say more about March 2020, to see if anybody would show up, basically. And I didn't know, but I wanted to be there in case they did. And amazingly, 16 women came to Guatemala to work with me on telling their stories. But then 2 days after they arrived, the president of Guatemala got on the TV and said, we're closing the airport. And many of the women went home, understandably. But the amazing thing was that 8 stayed, and we had this extraordinary week just as the world was changing all around us, gathered, kind of hunkered down. Our chef had to leave, so I hired a bunch of local indigenous women in the village who made us simple, good meals, healthy meals. And we told our stories, and no plane came. I knew a plane was going to come, but it took, I think, 13 days before one came. And by the time the plane arrived to bring people home, I knew I didn't want to go home, that I was in the best possible place for a very hard situation. And I invited 2 of the women in the workshop, who I didn't know before, Jenny and Shiren, they were the 2 youngest ones in the workshop, to join me. And I figured we'd be at my house at Lake Atitlan, in this little Mayan indigenous village where there was no COVID, for a few weeks. And we weren't stuck, but I have to tell you, we stayed 6 months that were possibly 6 of the most inspiring and magical months of my life. while I recognized, well, the world was in a great deal of pain. And the first thing I did was to finish my novel, Count the Ways. I used to, every day, I'd go up to my little writing cabin. The girls had their projects. One was a musician. One was a kind of political activist who was doing a podcast. And every night we would gather for a dinner that we would make together in this totally silent world, this 50 square mile lake where there were no boats, no, just birds and stars and a volcano. And I would read out loud to them from Count the Ways. And then a terrible thing happened. I finished the book and they said, what now? We want more stories. So I started a new book, and that was The Bird Hotel. And I always want to tell that story because it really, I think it has the feeling of a story that I spun out over these magical nights under the stars by the shores of a lake, looking out to a volcano and telling a bedtime story to the girls. And every morning I'd get up and they'd rush me off to my desk at 6:30 in the morning and say, go write another chapter. We want to know what happens next. So the book is written. I always thought of it as sort of like my Arabian Nights. It's slightly magical in some places, although I think the characters behave in a way that people do behave. That's important to me. The main character is a North American woman, but she's in an imaginary Central American country that bore a lot of resemblance to the place where I was when I was writing.
And you had the lake and
we had the lake, we had the volcano, we had birds. I think there are officially more species of birds in Guatemala than any other place on the planet. I could be wrong about that, but there sure are a lot, including, of course, the quetzal, a bird that gave its name to the money. The country in the Bird Hotel is not, I never identify it as Guatemala, but there is a volcano and there is a lake and there is an indigenous population. And there were some people who felt that as a white, non-Latina, non-indigenous writer, I had no business setting a novel in a Central American country. And so this book has had a sort of a rockier road because of that. It was ultimately published by a very small press that was willing to put this book out in the world. In no way do I appropriate the point of view of a Latina or indigenous person. But I have to say, even as I say that I am deeply troubled as a writer as a writer who absolutely supports the importance of diverse voices in the arts, in all fields, as they were not when I was young, represented. But it also seems to me deeply troubling that we should now be told there are certain stories you're not allowed to tell.
I mean, having read the book, I had heard that before, but it's literally saying you can't go anywhere as yourself. Let's say that, Irene in the book is you, is a person like you, could be, you.
And I
went somewhere that you're not allowed to tell about her trip.
It's very much the story of a North American woman in this place, living as an expat. She has an event take place in her life, and I won't say what it is, of course, because I need to read the book, but she has a devastating tragedy. And she gets on a bus headed somewhere south, doesn't even really care where she's going, doesn't care if she lives or dies, and ends up in this little village at a hotel, a very dilapidated, sort of run-down place, but kind of a magical place too, on the shores of this lake that bears a lot of resemblance to my house on the shores of Lake Atitlan, my house as it was then, run by an expat woman, an old expat woman. And for reasons that I will not divulge, she ends up not only running the hotel, but discovering that her life isn't over after all and being sort of reborn.
So I was thinking, I know you've said that you don't plan, like you don't know how your book will end.
Never.
So on this book or other books, like let's say on this book, how does that work? Where do you figure out where it ends? And I'm asking this also because I read on Facebook recently, you said on your latest book you just finished that you realized you had to redo it, the ending. You had to fix the ending.
Well, details of the end, but no, actually it's true. I never know. I never have a plan. What I know is who my characters are, and I know the kind of people they are and the sorts of things they would do. And I know instantly, this is not like a rule of writing. There is no rule of how you lay out a novel. But for me, an essential aspect that keeps me excited is finding out what's going to happen. I always think of myself as my first reader. And I tell that story about reading to Jenny and Irene because we were all like, we were so excited about this story. What's going to happen next? So I set them into motion, and then rather like parenthood, where we, give birth to these people whose lives we briefly are in charge of, but very soon they have their own ideas. That's my characters too.
So when you were reading to them that at your house, did they sometimes have you change things? Did they say, oh,
I did things for them for sure. There's an Asian, Shiren was born in China, and I probably wouldn't have presumed to write an Asian character, but there was Shiren. And so there is this woman who comes to the hotel from China, and she has a very specific mission in coming there. And I was hugely informed by Shiren. There's another character who comes from the UK, and Jenny did too. So as is true of all my novels, I draw from my experience in every direction. I don't steal the stories of any of my writing students. That's absolutely would be forbidden. I work with memoir and it's confidential, but I have personally been informed by hearing and thinking about the stories of hundreds of women now that I've worked with, and they're there in my books in different forms. And certainly, gosh, I've been going to Guatemala for 50 years now. So Guatemala is very much indigenous culture. Mayan culture is very much a part of the fabric of my life.
So when you mentioned how it was 50 years, how you ended up going there, when you went there, how you ended up there?
I first went there in 1973 when I was 20 years old. And I had, honestly, when I was writing The Bird Hotel, I did not connect my own life with the story I was telling, but it occurs to me that I too felt that I had a tragedy and I needed to just leave the world for a while. I had had a heartbreak at age 20, and I believed nothing would ever be okay again, as sometimes one does feel when one has a heartbreak at age 20.
Yeah.
And I set off for Mexico and met an older couple who were retired artists living in Oaxaca, and they invited me to go on an orchid hunt to Guatemala. It was a crazy thing to do, to go looking for orchids in the rainy season in a country that was having a civil war that the United States was not on a good side of. And it was a dangerous thing in those days to be an American, North American in Guatemala. But I fell in love with that country and that culture and that lake, even in those difficult circumstances. And I didn't go back for many years, but in my late 40s, I returned there. And that time I stayed, and I got a house, a simple little house on the shores of that lake that became my writing retreat, the place where I've probably finished 6 or 7 books at this point. I've had a home on the shores of Lake Atitlan for over 20 years now. And once a year, I would go down and teach. Now I do it a few times a year because a lot of women want to come and work with me. And so I go a few times a year to only women and only memoir. But I love to assist others, whether they call themselves writers or not, in the telling of their stories. It has been such a gift in my life getting to tell mine. I feel so lucky that I've been able to be a writer all my adult life. Easier ways to support your family and earn a living for sure, but I love what I do. I've just, as you know, because we were talking about this before we started, I just 2 days ago finished a new novel, and I'm still sort of wired up. I barely entered the world for a few weeks there when I was.
So I have a few questions. So one is, okay, just a small question. How does you for anyone who doesn't know, Joyce's Facebook page is amazing because I've been reading for probably 10 years, and you just tell little, many days you'll tell us something really deep and important. It might just be, it's not like a picture just of like, oh, here I am. You tell us real
I write
stories.
real stories. I do. And it's very important to me. One of the things I did for many years was to write in magazines.
Right.
And the magazines no longer exist. So there wasn't a place for my stories in the same way. But truthfully, I love the immediacy of something happens and I sit down and write, and there it is. Nobody's paying me. That's one minor detail. But other than that, I think when Facebook became really important to me was in the 9 years ago, when my very dear, good second husband, who I had only met in my late 50s, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer a year after we were married. And it was an excruciating 19 months that we fought to save his life. Jim died 7 years ago, a few weeks. And the most comforting thing for me was reaching out to readers on that page, and not woe is me, but just talking about the things that we were going through. And the day he had the big surgery that we hoped would save his life, I didn't really want people with me in the waiting room, but I had my laptop. I wrote, and that's actually what I've done all my life. I write my way through my life.
I had started reading you then. I actually met you when you spoke at Yale. You were on your way to Mass General to meet. He had come first, and I happened to be there that day, and I saw the flyer. I hadn't met you then at that point. It's like, oh, of course, I'm going to this. And I remember meeting you, but you were on your way. And then, so that's when I started reading your Facebook. So all the way, that whole journey with you. And it was meaningful to everyone, I think, who read it.
I have real life friends who I actually, come over for dinner.
Yes.
But I have to say that readers have been a huge gift in my life. Readers like you who are out there, and I'm very aware of writing for those people. I know those people. I hear the voices of readers when I write. And truthfully, I'm a writer who's really depended on readers. I've had an odd career. I was sort of canceled when I published my memoir At Home in the World, and nobody would touch me for a long time because of telling that story, that sort of forbidden story. And it was readers who kept me going.
What was it? I have so many things. I was thinking about the readers. So when you wrote Count the Ways, I know from your, reading you on Facebook and other places that your readers really, really wanted a sequel. And so that's the book that
I had not intended to write a sequel to Count the Ways.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. I created this story of a woman and her family. It's a big span. It starts, when she's a teenager. She's exactly the years of me. So she would have been born in probably 1953. And we pick up with her in her teenage years. And it goes through her falling in love, the marriage of the deeply romantic. And actually, she meets a guy in Brattleboro. He's at a craft fair in Brattleboro.
Oh, right.
He makes wooden burl bowls. Cam is his name. And they fall in love, and they have babies, and they live on a farm. Many things that actually do resemble my life, although this story is not my life, and the things that happen in that family are different. But I know the territory, and the themes are very much the themes of family and parenthood and marriage, and the death of a marriage, the slow death of a marriage. Her marriage ends, and I follow her through her years as a single mother. And so the first book ended in 2009, and readers would write to me. They loved the book. The book did really well, but many readers were very upset too. And they they wrote that they felt that Eleanor's life had been too hard and too self-sacrificing. I must have heard from 10 women who said, and men, I remember there was one man who said they threw my book down on the ground. They were so angry about the choices she was making, to which I had to say, it's not the job of a writer to give us characters who necessarily do all the right things. We wouldn't have much of a story if they did. They have to make mistakes.
Right.
So people said, don't leave her there. We need to see what happens next. And I actually waited a full year and a half after finishing Count the Ways and getting all those letters to write the sequel, which will come out next summer, because I felt such a responsibility to readers and to that character. So I'm very excited. If
And
I
also
see
the kids in the
wired
book.
up and the children.
I mean, because I'm just thinking as a
She
reader.
has 3 children who
Yeah.
we meet when they're born, and they're now in their 30s and 40s, as my children are. And I wanted to see what would happen to them. And there's some new characters who come in too. And there is a great love affair for her, but it's not a story of a woman whose life all gets fixed by a man coming galloping along on a white stallion either.
One of the things I love about that book and all your books is the music that you have in the books. It
Lots
feels
of
like
music.
it's so real. It's like, the radio is just on, and also the news, like you really put, in Count the Ways, like.
I mean, I think that's like our lives,
Yeah.
Somebody said, I was talking on Facebook about the fact that there's no way to set a novel, as the new one will be, between the ages of the years 2009 and 2023, and not mention what happened in 2016.
Right.
Of course, also 2020 and many other things. And somebody came on and said, oh, I hope this novel isn't going to be political. Well, yes, life is political. Everything is political to me. So yes, Eleanor throws a party thinking that her candidate is going to win, and she bakes a chocolate cake and invites all her friends over and gets lobster, and we all know what happened. And if I offend some people who felt that was a great night, then that's okay. I'll live with it. But it's a very personal, it's not me sort of spouting off on my political views, but my characters are out in the world experiencing the things that we do. They go to the movies, they turn on music. And I have them, for instance, in this book, I'm not going to give anything away when I say this. John Prine, she listens to John Prine, and then John Prine dies.
I know you love John Prine.
I love John Prine. And I think it was true for many people who love John Prine that his death felt like a very personal loss. So yeah, there are odd particular aspects of things that happen in the world. In the first book, the Challenger exploded, but it was told through the lens of a mother who sends her child off to school that day.
That's one of the most powerful things, many powerful things in that book, but that's really, you build it up. And then
I was such a mother, of course.
Did one of your kids have that same?
Not that. She didn't have a Krista McAuliffe NASA suit, but that's me ramping up the storytelling. But
sure. No, I just meant that, well, your kids are that age, and
they were those ages. And I think people of, well, you're younger than me, but I'll say of our generation, have these experiences that are both global and personal. We all know where we were, if we're old enough, when JFK was assassinated. We know where we were on September 11th. And so my novels are the stories of people's kitchens and living rooms and bedrooms, but there's also what's going on the TV set and on the radio and out the door.
So actually, there's a question in the chat that is relevant to this.
I'm not seeing these questions, so I'm going to depend.
Don't worry. There's do your experiences writing fiction and nonfiction differ? This is from Lisa.
Oh, good question, Lisa. Well, of course, in terms of, you could say when I'm writing memoir, I know what the story is. Sort of, I know, but a good memoir is not, this is what happened. So part of it is discovering what you learned and what your journey was, which is different. I wrote a book about finding and losing my very good second husband. It's not a book about pancreatic cancer. It's a book about love, actually. It's a book about marriage. But always the common element, whether it's a memoir or a novel, is I've got to keep you turning the pages. I've got to tell a really good story. And I love story. I am a storyteller.
You really do. You're great.
Daughter of a really great storyteller, my mother, who could absolutely have a whole room transfixed if she started to tell a story. So there are always stories. And in the case of the memoirs, I usually discover some things that I didn't know about my life in the course of writing it, which is one of the gifts that it's one of the reasons why I so love to help women tell their story, because it won't be just, oh, I'm going to put down all these facts so my grandchildren will know it someday. It's, oh my gosh, I never thought about that before, but now I see my father in a different way than I understood before.
I have another question. Thank you
Yes.
for that. Amy Abrams Persicini.
Persicini. Hi, Amy.
You know her.
I know my readers.
Okay, I thought so, because she said this is a question.
Kansas City.
From me. What is your feeling about the political correctness that has gone to extremes with regards to writing about people of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, which you start, and then let me feed the whole thing. And then what about an author writing from an old woman's point of view when she is young, or a young boy's perspective when this author is a middle-aged woman?
Well, you know, I'm going to say go for it. I am for imagination.
Yeah.
I don't just write what I know. I write about what I want to discover. I mean, when I wrote Labor Day, I got to be a boy. I wrote that whole novel from a male point of view. I've gotten to be a killer. I've gotten to be people of many different ages. So yeah, and imagine, I won't even start to list all the literary, the classics and others that we would not have if writers over time were held to the requirements that, you know, that we are now being told exist.
I was thinking I forgot to ask you to read. So why don't you do a little reading?
Oh, great. And you know, it's so much fun talking that I'm going to read only a very short passage.
And I want to tell everyone that your books, and I know you've even gone back and read, narrated, like looking back. You just did that one, right?
I just did. That was my very first book that sort of a weird experience. I made the audiobook of Looking Back. There never had been an audiobook. And I'm reading the words that my 18-year-old self wrote. And I constantly wanted to change them. You know, I thought, oh, that was ridiculous. But no, that was what I thought then. I needed to be true to that. I did put a little after in the audiobook of Looking Back. I have a conversation with a young Yale student of now about that book. And that was essential to give it some context. But I love recording audiobooks. I love reading out loud. So good. I used to love reading to my children.
Actually, before you read, I just realized, since you mentioned Yale, maybe you want to just tell people the journey about Yale and how you.
Oh gosh. Well, you know, I'm part of that generation, that second wave feminist, you know, that suddenly the doors opened for us in all the ways that they were closed for our mothers. So I was in the third class of women at Yale in the early 70s, dropped out for love. That's the story I tell in A Home in the World. And I never really, so I had 1 year of college. I'm the daughter of people who deeply believed in education, 2 teachers, but I was a college dropout. And I never pictured going back. I was putting 3 kids through college and school. But after Jim died, after my husband died, I knew I had to have a big adventure. I had to put myself out in the world in new ways. I think one of my helpful skills is resilience. So I decided I'd go back to college at the age of 65, and I had to reapply. I went to Yale, and they wanted my SAT scores from 1970. Wow. And I got in, and I did go back. I rented out my house, and I went back and lived in a tiny little apartment in New Haven, and I got 2.5 years of Yale before COVID came along. And so I am now officially a two-time Yale dropout, and that's okay. I had a great experience for those 2 years. And it was never really about the degree. But I loved being at school. I loved being around young people, and I learned a lot.
I loved reading about when you were at, on Facebook, you wrote about that. Someone asked the question, and I think I know, will you ever write a memoir about your time at Yale? And I think that's.
I may someday. Yeah. I may someday. It's sort of been sitting with me.
I would love to read. I think a lot of people would love to read that. Just for all of us older to think, what was it like, to be there at one point and come back?
I might be the only person who's been at Yale with 48 years in between time one and time two. Yeah.
Thank you. Now,
Okay, I'm going to just read the first page and a paragraph, a very short bit from the Bird Hotel. We're jumping all over, and I love that. That's my kind of conversation. So this is page 1. The chapter is called One Thing About Hard Times. I was 27 years old when I decided to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. One afternoon, I had this great life. Half an hour later, all I wanted was to be dead. I took a taxi. It was just after sunset when I reached the bridge, rising up through the mist, that wonderful shade of red I had loved back when I still cared about the colors of things and bridges and getting to the other side of them. Back when I cared about so many things that now seemed meaningless. Before leaving my apartment that last time, I'd stuffed $100 bill in my pocket. I gave this to the driver. Why wait for change? There were tourists, of course, traffic heading in and out of the city, parents with children in strollers. I used to be one of those. A boat was passing under the bridge. From where I stood preparing to jump, I watched it make its way under the pilings, men mopping the deck. Nothing made sense anymore. I'd been dimly aware of an elderly man watching me. He might try to stop me, so I waited for him to move on, and after a few minutes, he did. Only I couldn't take that last step up onto the railing over the bridge, over the edge. One thing about hard times, Lenny had said once, when our rent check bounced, the same week Arlo got sent home from daycare with head lice, and I came down with mono, and a pipe burst in our apartment that destroyed a stack of drawings I'd been working on for 6 months. Once you hit bottom, things can only get better. Standing on the bridge, looking down at the dark and swirling water, I think I recognized something about myself. Even though the place in which I now found myself was terrible, some small part of me couldn't let go of the world. The fact of grieving a vast loss, as I did, had to serve as some kind of reminder that life was precious, even mine, even then. I stepped away from the rail. I couldn't do it. But I couldn't ever go home either. I had no home anymore. This is how I ended up at the Bird Hotel. Yes. Incidentally, the cover of this book is a detail from a painting that I own, that I commissioned from an indigenous painter, a very fine painter, Diego Isaias Hernandez, in Guatemala. And it's a, you probably can't see it too well on the screen, but it's a volcano, it's a volcanic eruption. And the big painting, which you can see on my website, my Joyce Maynard website, shows the whole painting, which is a whole scene of all kinds of drama, some of which I put into this book.
Wow, I have 3 questions here now, and then I think we have a special
guest.
Guest, but I will ask these questions. Who are your favorite authors, and do you experience literary envy?
Oh gosh, probably when I was younger, I did. No, I experienced kinship. This is really embarrassing. No, it's not embarrassing. I'm not embarrassed by anything. I could be embarrassed by this. I am not a good reader. And it is something that I have kept secret for most of my life because it seemed so shameful that a writer would have read as little as I have. I'm a very slow reader, and reading is hard for me. And finally, at the age of 65, when I went back to college, a really smart French teacher who just observed my performance on exams said, "Has anybody ever tested you for learning differences?" And nobody had. Of course, people of our generation weren't tested. They were just stupid or something. And the minute she said that, gears began moving. I was tested, and I have severe ADHD. Big surprise. Some people watching this might have guessed. And part of it is that I have a huge problem reading. But having said that, I will say that, yeah, the book that I have most recently read and loved, that's a new book, came out this summer by my friend Andre Dubus, who I believe the third is coming
Yeah,
to the
and he's
Literary
coming.
Festival.
Yeah.
It's called Such Kindness, and I love that novel. And there's a character, I don't know if you noticed, there's somebody sort of hovering in the
Yes,
back.
yeah.
So in a red hat, this is.
Yes, I'd like to meet her.
Yes,
like
so I will explain who this individual is. If you have read some of my work, and if you read At Home in the World, then you know that I was raised in a household of passionate lovers of language, my parents. My mother should have had a career as a writer. She would have had a brilliant career, but she was one of those wives and mothers of the 50s, living in a small New Hampshire town, who did not have the opportunities that I had, and many of us at my age suddenly were granted. And so she poured her prodigious energy and brilliance and ambition into her daughters and made sure that we would have lives different from hers. And I grew up in a boot camp of writing. I was giving dictation before I could spell. And it's not something that I would replicate, nor did I with my children. But there was no way to grow up in that household and not know how to write. And so much that she taught me is there when I teach writers. And there's only one other person of her school of writing alive on this planet, and she happens to be here at my house. And that's my sister, Rona Maynard, who is also a writer, who also has a new book out this summer, a wonderful book, a memoir called Starter Dog. The two of us are doing an event tomorrow in Keene at the Toadstool at 11 a.m. Keene. If you didn't get enough of me today, and if you want more of my sister, we'll be at Toadstool tomorrow at 11 talking about Bird Hotel and Starter Dog and being writers and being sisters, which is a complicated relationship. There were only two of us, and we are the last women standing. So anyway, I'm going to bring my sister on.
Great.
And this is Rona Maynard. Rona, let's go sit. I think we could sit over here, and then we can sit close to each other.
Oh, yes.
Rona has come all the way from Toronto. Possibly, the light isn't good here. Let's go out on the porch. So Rona's come all the way from Toronto, partly to do this event in Keene, partly to have my blueberry pie, I think.
I bet that's great.
Right here. Is this good?
Yes.
That's good. Hello.
Yeah. So this is Jenny.
Hi.
And you're going to have we'll see how the light is. I think it's better this way. Yeah. And this is Rona and the famous dog. You want to sit here, Rona?
Yes, I'll sit here.
Yeah. So tell me first, can you see us okay?
I'm just waiting till do you have a seat? Yeah, now we can. Yeah, get a
Hi.
little
You might
closer.
want to take your
Hi,
hat off.
Jenny, and I'll take
Hi.
my hat off.
And-
so
and
that
this is
I do have a
This is the
face.
Brattleboro community that has a literary
Yep,
festival.
we have a
that
lot of
I
people
love,
on.
incidentally.
Right now.
And I don't think there's anybody better to describe Starter Dog than you. I
Yes,
could.
would you
Why
tell us
should
about
I
your
know?
book? You both sisters have the new books this summer.
I had left a big job as editor of Canada's iconic women's magazine. I was high and dry emotionally. I didn't have a project. And I thought I needed one. I thought that was the answer to life, to be working and achieving and directing. I did not know what was wrong with me. And when my husband said, let's get a dog, I thought, what a cockamamie idea, because we're 65 years old. Doesn't a dog need a kid to chase a ball in the backyard? But out of love, I said yes to my husband. I did not know if I could love a dog. That was the open question. And lo and behold, the dog gambled through the door and I was smitten. And a door opened up in my heart and mind. And I discovered that some of the most important things about being human, you can't learn from your own kind. So that is what the book is about. It's really a book about living with change and age and transitions. And what I needed was a dog.
I have to say, this book, I love this book. This book is not, you could be a person who didn't particularly care about dogs and still love this book. I do actually love dogs, but it's really, your marriage is a part of this story too.
Yes, I've been married for 52 years. We celebrated our 50th in lockdown. And my husband is a key character in the book. I dedicated it to him. I have to say that our father is also a character in the book, a significant one, because he was one of those difficult people who related better to animals than to other humans. He had great tenderness for any living creature. It could be a bat. It could be a starling. It could be the most scorned of animals.
And you had a hard time with our father.
I had a terribly hard
I'm getting
time
the plug.
with him.
You hold this while I get the charger. You keep talking.
Okay. I thought, why don't you care about us as much as you care about the starlings that are trapped under the eaves of our home? Why is it so important to you to rip out the newspaper that has been put in to keep the starlings from fouling the steps? Why can't you give some of that effort to your wife and children? I was very, very judgmental. And then I discovered that an animal is the connection to the vulnerable part of our human selves, to that soft, easily wounded part. And if the animal is a dog, well, the dog is funny and the dog makes you laugh a lot. So it's impossible to be too serious if there is a dog in the house. And the dog really lightened me up.
And how old, when did you get the dog?
Over 8 years ago. He is now a senior dog. At the thought of not having him forever, I am very sad.
Here he is.
But
Speak of the
I didn't
devil.
need to bring that up. I just wasn't sure how long. This has been. Oh, wow. Look at this view also. Dog and the view.
Yeah, there he is. That's Casey.
Actually,
Here's Lake Whittemore.
wow. I was thinking, I saw that you had written a book about being a grandmother. There was a book about that on your website. And I wanted to ask you both, because it was about ways of being a grandmother and what that was, if that's something, just, I was just thinking about the dog and like what this other new thing, which people don't really talk about much, what it's like to be a grandmother.
I actually wrote an essay that was a part of a collection, but yes, I have written about a grandmother, about being a non-doting grandmother.
What does that mean?
It means that I don't even carry photos of my grandchildren in my wallet, and I never have. I have been very much of the opinion that children have their own life, and I have my own life. I love my grandchildren very much, but I have never wanted them to be in my pocket. And I'm a reserved person by nature. Joyce is very much the opposite. When one of our grandsons went home after spending the day with us, he told his father, "Grandma read a book to me." And my son said, "Was it about a dog?" And he knew that I had read Cameron, The Sailor Dog by Margaret Wise Brown, which was my favorite book ever. That was the gateway book, the starter book for me. And it was just a foregone conclusion that I would not have a big library of children's books for the grandchildren, but I would have this one book that I loved, and I would share that with them.
Joyce, thank you. Joyce, what's it like for you, different from your, I know it's different, but how is it different for you?
Oh, I am a sucker for babies and toddlers and children of almost every age, but I will say that as a person who was so immersed in parenthood for so long, for me, this age is not defined by grandparenthood. I'm also, I have to say, I really carry very strongly the recognition of how many people do not have children, or don't have easy relationships with their children, or don't have grandchildren, or can't see them. And for those people, the world full of people talking about how great their grandchildren are is painful. And so I was very clear when I wrote the sequel to Count the Ways that it was not going to be about Eleanor discovering the joys of grandparenthood. It was going to be Eleanor discovering Eleanor. It's so easy for women in particular to give themselves over to everybody else before them. So yeah, I could say, of course, I have the cutest grandchildren in the world. Everybody does, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about them. I'm very interested, I have to say, in the sister relationship,
Yes,
because
let's talk about that.
we've been sisters all my life.
Yes, yes. And I once asked Joyce, and it was such a dumb question. When did you become aware that I was your sister? Now, what kind of question is that?
Well, it does. In some ways, it was more relevant for us than for some, because we were not really tight sisters for much of our lives. We had, I think I attribute no fault to my sister for this, but we were set up very much as competitors and compared to each other, and grew up in a household where there was an enormous amount of strain and trouble. And it didn't, I look back with a lot of sorrow that, it should be that the siblings would find comfort with each other, but often that's not what happens when there's an alcoholic parent. I'll just say that was our form of trouble, our big form of trouble. We could have talked with each other about that, but instead we went to our separate rooms.
And it was just never going to happen, that conversation. Yeah. I was blamed for a lot of the discomfort in our home because I was angry at my father. And once in adolescence, I wouldn't speak to him for a few days. He had grabbed me and dragged me upstairs and thrown me in my room, and I could not forgive him for that.
And I was this cheerful,
Yes.
happy, make everything
Yes.
okay.
Different. So we played very different roles. I was what they call in family therapy, the identified patient. I was the one who got sent to counseling as a little girl. And I was the one that our parents could worry about and agonize about and say, oh, her manners are so terrible. She's got to shape up. And meanwhile, Joyce was just doing everything right. She was really showing me up. And I did not, of course, Joyce was not going to be my ally in those situations. I scorned that. I scorned the habit of making our parents happy, but there really was.
And I remember thinking it would be so easy. Just be nice. Just smile. Now there is a big cost. There is a big cost to being nice.
I didn't think I had a lot to smile about. Now, I don't want to exaggerate my unhappiness because I did laugh. I was capable of having fun. I had a natural sense of humor, but I was also a very morose girl, and openly depressed through my teens. And yet, as I look back on our lives, I think Joyce had just as much depression as I had. It just took a different form, and it happened at a different stage. There's going to be a price to pay for bottling up all the feelings that you cannot express because you're so busy being mommy and daddy's little ray of sunshine. There comes a point where the mind and the body just go on strike. And I think that is what happened.
And I actually made a character in the new book that I just finished, who is that girl, the happy daughter who tried to fix everything in the family. And I'm guessing that, my hope is that tomorrow, when we have our event tomorrow, that there will be some sisters who come together.
Yes,
and
I
maybe
hope
there's some
so.
sisters listening now. It's such a, there were whole years of our lives when we really barely spoke, because I think we had such distance created between us, and our roles had been cast so differently. Our mother died when we were quite young. I was 35 and Rona was 39. And really that was an experience that sort of shattered us both, but we dealt with it so differently.
We dealt with it differently, and we did not deal with it well. I can definitely say that neither of us dealt with it well. And part of the reason for that was that she had been holding the whole family together, and she had determined how all the pieces fitted like little Lego blocks. And when the central block was gone, the Lego house fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't know how to function anymore. And we didn't have the life experience to see what was happening, because we were the first people we knew who had gone through this,
Who were orphans.
we were
Yes. Orphans. We were 30,
yes.
35 and 39.
And nobody said to us, you better watch out for some of these things that happen when a parent is terminally ill and there's a long history of alcoholism and depression and dysfunction in the family.
I will say a wonderful thing came out of, well, it didn't come out of the experience of our mother's death, but some years later, we had a real falling out over our mother's death, as I don't think that's uncommon. And some years later, I want to say almost 20 years later, 18 years later, a magazine that I wrote for often that no longer exists. Actually, I went to them and I suggested that they have both of us, we were both writers, that each of us write an essay about being the sister to the other, and that they run both of our essays. And the editor liked that idea and gave us only one ground rule, which was easy to abide, that we should not speak to each other about our essays. And we barely ever spoke to each other anyway. We had to look up my sister's phone number at that point. So we wrote our essays. And I don't know that I read yours until the magazine came out.
I think you might have read it before on approval.
Yeah,
like
but very near the end.
In a typescript, but no,
So
we obeyed.
Joyce posted these.
I posted them. They're on my
page,
and
and
I think they're on Rona's as well. Rona Maynard.
They're very powerful. Maybe we'll repost after your event tomorrow or something, because they're really amazing.
And I think that was the beginning of our finding our way back to each other, because really we both ended up, although we didn't have any plan, we both ended up writing about the death of our mother. And we told that story so differently, which is kind of a lesson among other things. I sometimes teach them when I'm teaching writing as a lesson in point of view. There is not the truth, there is your truth and your perspective and the way it looks through your eyes. And one of the great lessons of growing older is learning how to look through somebody else's eyes and locate empathy for a point of view that didn't come naturally, but you say, oh, now I get it. I see how that must have felt for her. So yeah, it was that it isn't that we fell into each other's arms at that point. We did not. I actually think that your getting Casey was a sort of a change in our relationship.
And I think there were a number of inflection points. One of them was Jim dying.
Mm-hmm.
Because I came out and I spent time with you, and it was close, good time. Joyce opened up her bedroom to me. She gave
It was
me
only
her
one
bedroom.
bed.
It was only one. And for me to spend time in Joyce's house is actually difficult, because although she is
It's so great.
she is in many ways a wonderful hostess, for me to live in her house for a few days is difficult, because there's always stuff going on and there's always noise, and everything is a mile a minute. And she doesn't have curtains, and I like a dark room, and I'm just a real princess that way. Everything has to be dark and calm and quiet, and she's the opposite. So
I think I guess I would make my sister a little nervous probably. And
but it did work. And I've now stayed in your house a couple of times, and I just go
You're doing
there
okay?
knowing we're
Yeah,
fine.
let us know after the weekend. Are you
there's
staying
a
there now?
pretty great pie that's going into the oven.
Yeah,
soon.
she-
That-
She makes, it was not okay to say this when our mother was alive. It was a great unspoken secret that Joyce's pie had become better than our mother's, but nobody was ever supposed to say that, because she had to make the best pie. Families have their rules, and she was the pie queen,
Yes.
and she was also the chicken queen.
By the way, you have in Labor Day, Joyce has this, there's a scene. Will you tell us just about that?
I even know the page. It's page 68. People are always asking me for the recipe for my pie. And I say, there is no recipe. The recipe is always the same. It's not about the recipe. It's about how you handle the dough. I didn't even know I knew how to make pie until my mother died. And then I realized, oh, I've been watching her make pie for, 30 years. I can make pie. And I do sort of make, my mother is very close to me when I make pie. But I have a character in my novel Labor Day, a convict on the run, an escaped convict who's holed up in a woman's house over in New Hampshire over a long, hot Labor Day weekend. And we don't know if he's bad or not bad, but he teaches, somebody comes by with a bowl of fresh peaches and he makes a peach pie. And how he describes to the mother and the son how he makes the pie is how I make a pie. So you can get Labor Day just for the instructions.
Just for the pie, or the movie for the pie scene, which I know
I'm
you.
looking at the time and thinking,
we
if
better-
there are questions we should.
Yes. Someone said, Joyce and Rona, please go on the road. This conversation is excellent. You
Well, we're
could.
going on the road as far
Tomorrow.
as Keene. Anyway, come to Keene tomorrow. There'll be more. There's a lot more where this came from. Yeah, we're looking forward to a very far-reaching conversation tomorrow, I think, at Toadstool, about our books, of course, but other things
Yes,
too.
we are excited. We've never done anything
Sounds great.
like this before, and I don't think anybody in the audience will have seen anything like this before.
And those essays that you wrote, I actually want to just say, there's a question here that I want to read.
Right.
I had no question, but I just wanted to let Joyce know that I had to stop reading The Bird Hotel just a few pages after what you've just been reading because of my personal history. But a month later, I had the strength to go back to it and I loved it. And it is very difficult to read. I just wanted to, what do you say to people who say that's too much?
Oh, I believe that books should be difficult. One of the experiences that I had at Yale that was very troubling was this new phenomenon of trigger warnings. And, almost any piece of great literature that, the class would be told, well, if this is too hard for you, leave the room. Sometimes things are hard, and that's a function of literature to, in a safe place between the covers of a book, visit places that we have visited in our lives that we didn't have control over. So yes, I think it's important that writers go to the dark places. And that's part of why I believe in teaching memoir.
So I guess we should stop. It's almost 6. It's 5:59. Do either of you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to tell everybody that and obviously I'm not selling a book here because it doesn't even exist, but one project that I'm really excited about is that I think my sister and I are going to write a book about being sisters.
Oh,
Wow.
you let the dog out of the bag.
Dog out of the bag. Yeah. And
That'll
so
be great.
we're thinking a lot about the sister relationship and listening to other sisters and what they have to say. So bring your sister tomorrow if you have one. And if you don't, that's too bad. A brother's good too, I'm sure. We never got one of those.
And if you're missing your sister, she can be with you in spirit.
That's true too.
Maybe we can
So
try to
much for
get
having
those.
us.
Thank you. And maybe we can get those.
And
essays.
to everybody who has never been to the Brattleboro Literary Festival, I want to recommend it. I've been to many festivals, and I have to say that one's right up at the top for me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's October 13th to 15th this year in Brattleboro. So thank you, everybody.
Great seeing you.
Thank you.
Wonderful to have you both, and wonderful to meet you, Rona. And to see
Bye-bye.
you again, Joyce.